The President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Gillian Triggs, joins me now in the studio. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Now, as Commissioner, have you been to Nauru?
I have not.
And why is that?
Because I operate on the basis of an Australian piece of legislation, and that legislation does not allow me to go to Nauru without a visa and without the invitation from the Nauruan government and the permission of the Australian government. And as I have neither, it's not been possible for me to go. In the meantime, however, I do have the jurisdiction to consider complaints from asylum seekers who are held there.
Now, does this make it hard to get evidence together? I mean, it's obviously harder, but do you feel that you have evidence, as this latest report, it's another report, suggests, of what's going on there?
Well, we gain evidence from a number of sources, some obviously from the people complaining themselves, but also particularly from the very high turnover of staff from Nauru who then come back and gave evidence before the Australian Human Rights Commission report. But I think it's probably worth making the point that we now have three reports: the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Moss report, and now the Senate Select Committee. And essentially the evidence about the dangerous nature of the environment there, the concerns about sexual abuse, the general safety or lack of it for children and their families is a consistent story across all of those reports. So we're really finding that one piece of evidence is backed by another.
Now, before we get into the recommendations of this latest report, with what you've just said there, what do you feel about the fact that Transfield Services will likely get a further 5-year contract, as they've said? Does that give you any confidence that the government is aware of what's happening on Nauru?
Well, I think it's been an extraordinary circumstance that the committee report should come out just as we hear reports of Transfield getting the contract. I think it's at least a matter of concern that the Senate Select Committee has been deeply concerned about the way in which Transfield has conducted the services through, I might add, a subcontractor, Wilson. And in those circumstances, I think one would at least want to question how they could be awarded another 5-year contract. And we're talking of billions of dollars here. But may I also make the point that somebody has got to provide these services. If it's the policy that holds families, children, young men in offshore processing, particularly in Nauru, it's the policy that's so detrimental to their mental and physical health and creates a dangerous environment for them. Somebody has to provide these services. So one doesn't necessarily want to demonise the company, except that the evidence produced before the Senate Committee and indeed to the other inquiries, including the Australian Human Rights Commission, is that Transfield, through its subcontractors, has failed to meet the standards of care that one would expect. So that's the problem. And I think in light of this now third report, we really should be asking questions as to why they're getting, or appear to be getting, another 5-year contract.
Now, arguably the most important recommendation to come from this latest report, that asylum seeker children and their families be removed from Nauru. Now, I assume you agree with that.
Well, we do. I mean, this is, of course, at the core of all of our work, that children should never be held in detention of this kind. And we've argued for a very long time that the impact of mandatory and indefinite detention on them and their families is extremely detrimental to their mental health and their physical health.
Because just how vulnerable are they?
Well, they're extremely vulnerable children, whether they're in Australian detention centres or on Christmas Island when they were being held there, and now on Nauru. Children seem to be able to manage for the first few weeks. I think there's an expectation that they're going to have a difficult time for a few weeks, and they understand, and children do understand a lot. They understand there's a certain resilience. But after 3 months, things start to fall apart for them. They're not getting proper education. On Christmas Island for a year, they got no education. One of the recommendations of this report is to improve the access to education for these children. But I think the crowded environment where their parents are suffering mental distress, it accumulates in relation to these children, so that in the end the medical experts, in particular Professor Isaacs, who was cited in this report, say that ultimately it's an unsafe environment for these children.
Now, there are other recommendations I should just mention, that reasonable access, which we were just speaking about before, and the downgrading of security to protect asylum seekers. But as we said, this is yet another report. What to next? Well,
I think it's very important that the Minister has agreed to consider the report. That's a positive statement. And it might be that the sheer volume of evidence now that's consistent across all of the three reports over the last couple of years will have an impact on a changing government policy. Perhaps it should be noted that there is nothing necessarily illegal about offshore processing. If we were to do it in a collaborative way with our regional neighbours to establish a centre where there was a proper legal system, where their claims to refugee status could be properly assessed in a speedy way, and then they would be given a safe passage to permanent settlement. There's nothing wrong with offshore settlement as such. It's just the way in which it's being conducted and the long-term detention. These children and their families have been detained on average for 1 year and 3 months in these tense and dreadful conditions. But for some of these children, it's been years in Australian detention centres, and more than that for some others on Nauru. So the conditions are bad, and my very sincere hope is that the government will look more closely at the way in which this policy is being carried out.